Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in life when two people stop speaking, and the silence between them becomes louder than any argument they ever had. When you and a narcissistic individual both stop contacting each other, something powerful begins to happen, not on the outside first, but inside the mind and spirit. You see, silence is not empty. Silence is a teacher. When communication between you and a narcissistic individual suddenly stops, many people assume nothing is happening. They believe the silence means the story is over, the connection is finished, and the emotional tension has simply disappeared. But the truth is far more complex and far more educational than most people realize. Silence is not an empty space between two people. Silence is a powerful environment where reality becomes visible. During the time when contact existed, the relationship was often filled with noise, arguments, explanations, emotional reactions, manipulation, and attempts to justify behavior. In that constant exchange, it becomes difficult for a person to see clearly. When communication finally stops, the noise disappears and something very important begins to happen. Patterns become visible. Many people do not understand that a narcissistic dynamic often survives through continuous emotional interaction. The attention, the reactions, the attempts to explain yourself, and even the arguments become a form of fuel. When that fuel disappears, the entire structure of the relationship begins to change. Silence interrupts the cycle that once kept the dynamic alive. For the person who was emotionally affected by the relationship, silence becomes a period of mental recovery. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. The mind may still replay old conversations, wondering what could have been said differently or how situations could have been handled better. But as time passes, something remarkable begins to develop: clarity. Clarity is one of the most powerful educational tools in human life. It allows a person to step outside the emotional storm and observe the situation from a distance. Without constant contact, the emotional pressure fades, and the mind starts analyzing experiences in a new way. You begin to notice the repeated behaviors, the patterns of manipulation, and the imbalance that existed in the relationship. This is where personal awareness grows. Many people spend years inside unhealthy dynamics because they are too close to the situation to see it accurately. When distance appears, the brain finally has space to process information logically instead of reacting emotionally. The silence becomes a classroom where lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and emotional intelligence begin to emerge. At the same time, the absence of contact often creates a different internal experience for the narcissistic individual. A person who relies heavily on attention, validation, or emotional reactions may find the silence extremely uncomfortable. In many cases, they are accustomed to influencing situations through communication, persuasion, or emotional pressure. When communication stops, their usual methods of control are no longer available. This creates an unexpected shift in power. For the first time, the person who once felt emotionally overwhelmed may begin to feel stability returning. The absence of constant influence allows them to reconnect with their own thoughts, their own values, and their own decisions. Instead of reacting to someone else's behavior, they begin responding to their own internal wisdom. And this transformation is often surprising. Many individuals discover that they are stronger than they originally believed. They realize that their identity was never meant to be shaped by someone else's approval, criticism, or emotional manipulation. Instead, identity grows through self-understanding and personal responsibility. The silence also introduces another important lesson. Not every relationship is meant to be maintained at all costs. Society often teaches people that every connection must be preserved, every conflict must be resolved through endless discussion, and every relationship must continue indefinitely. However, wisdom teaches a different perspective. Some separations are not failures, they are opportunities for growth. When communication ends, it gives both individuals the space to confront their own realities. One person may use the silence to reflect, learn, and develop healthier emotional boundaries. The other may struggle with the absence of attention and attempt to recreate the old dynamic in various ways. But the most important development occurs within the person who chooses growth. Instead of using their energy to analyze the other person's behavior, they begin investing their energy into their own development. They study their experiences, strengthen their self-respect, and build a clearer understanding of what healthy relationships should look like in the future. Over time, the silence that once felt uncomfortable begins to feel empowering. It becomes a reminder that emotional peace is not created through constant interaction with others, but through internal stability and self-awareness. The absence of contact becomes a turning point where a person moves from confusion to understanding, from emotional dependence to personal strength. And this is why the period after contact ends is often the most transformative stage of the entire experience. What initially feels like loss gradually reveals itself as education. What once felt like rejection slowly becomes redirection. In the quiet space where communication once existed, a person discovers something far more valuable than closure. They discover clarity, strength, and the freedom to build healthier connections in the future. Silence between two people who were once constantly communicating is never just silence. It becomes a mirror. When both you and the narcissistic individual stop contacting each other, the first thing that begins to unfold is a shift that many people do not immediately recognize. For a long time, the relationship may have been structured around reactions. One person pushes, the other responds. One person provokes, the other explains. One person manipulates, the other defends. In that pattern, the narcissistic personality often feels powerful because control is maintained through emotional responses. But when contact stops completely, that system collapses. The dynamic that once gave them influence suddenly disappears. What many people fail to understand is that attention is a form of psychological currency. Every time you react emotionally, argue, defend yourself, or try to prove your innocence, you are unknowingly supplying energy to a system that survives on your engagement. When you remove that engagement, the power equation begins to change. At first, the narcissistic person may appear calm or indifferent, but internally something very different begins to occur. The absence of attention creates discomfort, not because they necessarily miss the relationship in a healthy emotional sense, but because the familiar source of validation and reaction has disappeared. This is where the power shift quietly begins. When you refuse to participate in the cycle of emotional reaction, you are no longer standing on the stage where manipulation happens. The conversation arena disappears. The arguments disappear. The explanations disappear. And when there is no stage, the performance loses its audience. Many people are shocked when they discover that the strength they thought the other person had was actually dependent on their own responses. Once those responses stop, the illusion of control weakens. At the same time, something profound begins to happen inside you. In the absence of constant emotional pressure, your mind begins to stabilize. When you were in regular contact, your thoughts may have been dominated by confusion, self-doubt, or the constant attempt to understand unpredictable behavior. But distance gives the brain space to process reality more clearly. Psychological fog slowly lifts. Patterns that once seemed complicated begin to appear obvious. Conversations you once replayed with guilt now reveal manipulation you could not see before. The silence becomes educational. Instead of reacting to the other person's words, you begin studying the pattern of the entire relationship. You notice how many conflicts were started over small issues, but escalated into major emotional storms. You begin realizing that many of your explanations were never truly heard because the goal was never understanding. The goal was control. And when that realization arrives, it changes the way you view the entire experience. Meanwhile, the narcissistic individual may experience their own internal conflict. People who rely heavily on admiration, validation, and emotional reactions often feel unsettled when those sources disappear. Some attempt to restore contact through indirect means. Others attempt to provoke a response through subtle signals, rumors, or sudden attempts at friendliness. The intention is often the same: to restore the previous dynamic where they once held influence. But if you remain grounded in your silence and personal growth, the balance continues shifting in your favor. The most surprising outcome of this process is that the silence that once felt painful begins to feel empowering. What originally seemed like loss gradually becomes clarity. You begin to realize that your emotional peace does not depend on another person's behavior. It depends on your boundaries and your willingness to protect your mental space. And when a person reaches that level of awareness, they stop chasing explanations from people who never intended to provide them. They stop investing emotional energy into cycles that lead nowhere. Instead, they begin investing that energy into their own development, their own purpose, and their own future. That is when the silence transforms from a period of absence into a period of awakening. Another powerful transformation begins to occur during this time of no contact, and it is something many people underestimate. Emotional detox begins. When a person spends a long period in a psychologically draining relationship, the mind becomes conditioned to constant tension. You may find yourself overthinking every conversation, anticipating criticism, or preparing explanations before you even speak. This is not because you are weak. It is because your nervous system adapted to survive in an unpredictable emotional environment. But when communication stops, Your mind slowly begins to recalibrate. At first, the quiet may feel uncomfortable. Many people who leave emotionally manipulative dynamics experience a strange sense of emptiness. The chaos that once filled their days disappears, and the absence of drama can feel unfamiliar. But over time, something remarkable happens. The mind begins to relax. The constant need to defend yourself fades. The emotional weight you carried begins to lift piece by piece. During this stage, self-reflection becomes extremely powerful. Without someone constantly influencing your perception, you can finally evaluate your own values and boundaries. You begin asking deeper questions. What kind of relationships truly align with your emotional well-being? What behavior should never again be tolerated in your life? What kind of environment helps you grow rather than shrink? These questions are not signs of bitterness. They are signs of emotional maturity. As your clarity increases, you also rediscover parts of your identity that may have been suppressed during the relationship. Interests you neglected suddenly return. Goals you once postponed begin to feel possible again. Your confidence gradually rebuilds because it is no longer being undermined by constant criticism, gaslighting, or emotional manipulation. The person you were before the confusion begins to reappear, but often in a stronger and wiser form. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it changes the direction of your attention. Instead of focusing on what the other person is doing, thinking, or planning, you begin focusing on your own growth. Your energy moves from reaction to creation. You start building a life that reflects your values rather than constantly adjusting to someone else's demands. And that is the real shock many people experience after both sides stop contacting each other. The greatest change does not happen in the other person's life, it happens in yours. The silence that once felt like rejection becomes the space where your emotional independence is rebuilt. The distance that once felt painful becomes the environment where wisdom develops. Eventually you realize that the absence of contact was not merely an ending. It was an opportunity to restore your peace, strengthen your boundaries, and build a future that is not controlled by the emotional instability of someone else. And when that realization fully settles in your mind, the silence is no longer something you fear. It becomes something you respect because it was the environment where you finally rediscovered yourself. When the communication finally stops between you and a narcissistic person, something begins to shift quietly beneath the surface. At first, it may feel strange, almost uncomfortable. For a long time, your mind was conditioned to expect messages, reactions, explanations, or emotional tension. Suddenly, that pattern disappears. In that silence, a powerful truth begins to emerge. Distance has a way of revealing things that closeness often hides. When people are deeply involved in emotionally manipulative relationships, clarity is often clouded by constant interaction. Conversations, arguments, apologies, and promises create a cycle that keeps the mind occupied. The more engaged you are, the harder it becomes to see the pattern. But once communication stops, the cycle is interrupted. Your mind is no longer responding to the next message or reacting to the next emotional trigger. Instead, it finally has the space to observe. And observation is the beginning of understanding. You begin to replay past experiences with a clearer perspective. Situations that once seemed confusing suddenly start to make sense. You start noticing how certain conversations always shifted blame, how your feelings were often minimized, or how attention and affection were given only when it benefited the other person. What once felt like isolated incidents begin to appear as repeated patterns. Silence creates a mirror for reflection. For the first time in a long while, your thoughts are no longer competing with someone else's narrative. The pressure to constantly explain yourself disappears. The need to defend your emotions fades. And slowly, your mind begins to detox from the emotional noise that once surrounded you. This emotional detox is powerful. It is similar to stepping out of a room that was filled with loud voices and finally hearing your own voice again. You begin to reconnect with your own judgment, your own intuition, and your own values. Things that once felt normal begin to feel questionable. Behaviors you once tolerated begin to look unhealthy. That is the power of distance. Distance does not simply separate people, it separates confusion from clarity. While this process is happening within you, something else may be happening within the other person. Individuals who rely heavily on attention, validation, or emotional reactions often struggle when that supply disappears. When the contact stops, they are suddenly faced with the absence of the response they once depended on. For someone who is used to controlling emotional dynamics, silence can feel like losing influence. The absence of reaction removes the feedback they once used to measure their power in the relationship. And when that feedback disappears, it often creates frustration or internal conflict. But here is where the real transformation occurs. While one person may be trying to understand why the silence exists, the other person has an opportunity to use that silence as a period of personal restoration. This is the moment where identity begins to rebuild. Many people do not realize how much of their emotional energy was invested in maintaining the relationship dynamic. They adjusted their words, their reactions, and sometimes even their personality to avoid conflict or maintain peace. Once the contact ends, that emotional investment begins to return to its rightful place, your own life. You start focusing on your own goals again. You begin reconnecting with interests and ambitions that were once pushed aside. You rediscover the parts of your personality that may have been suppressed during the relationship. Confidence slowly rebuilds, not because someone else validates you, but because you start trusting your own judgment again. This process is not instant. Growth rarely happens overnight. But silence creates the environment where growth becomes possible. It teaches you patience. It teaches you emotional discipline. Most importantly, it teaches you the difference between attachment and self-respect. Many people believe that closure must come from another person. They wait for explanations, apologies, or acknowledgement. But one of the most important lessons silence can teach is that closure is often something you create for yourself through understanding. When you begin to see the relationship clearly, you no longer depend on the other person to define the ending. Your awareness becomes the conclusion. And with that awareness comes freedom. Freedom to make healthier decisions in the future. Freedom to establish stronger boundaries. Freedom to recognize manipulation before it takes root again. The silence that once felt uncomfortable slowly becomes something valuable because it provided the one thing constant interaction never allowed: perspective. Perspective transforms experience into wisdom. Instead of carrying bitterness, you carry lessons. Instead of repeating the same emotional patterns, you begin to recognize them early and avoid them. The experience that once drained you becomes a source of knowledge that strengthens your character. In this way, the absence of communication does something surprising. It stops being a loss and begins to feel like a turning point. What seemed like the end of a connection becomes the beginning of self-understanding. And sometimes the most powerful conversations in life are not the ones we have with others, but the ones we have with ourselves during moments of silence. When communication suddenly stops between you and someone who thrives on control, something deeper than silence begins to unfold. Many people think that when two individuals stop contacting each other, the story simply ends. But in reality, that moment often marks the beginning of a psychological shift. When attention is removed, the environment that once allowed manipulation to operate begins to collapse. Silence creates a space where truth slowly becomes visible. In the absence of constant emotional interaction, behaviors that once seemed confusing begin to make sense. You start to see patterns you missed before. Conversations that once left you doubting yourself begin to look very different when viewed from a distance. The silence becomes like a mirror reflecting what was truly happening all along. This is why silence is powerful. It removes distractions and exposes character. When communication stops, there is no performance left, no emotional theater, no carefully crafted responses designed to maintain influence. What remains is the raw reality of each person's emotional capacity. One person begins to reflect, grow, and regain clarity, while the other may struggle with the loss of control that attention once provided. Another transformation that occurs during this period is the shift of power. In many toxic dynamics, control is maintained through constant engagement. The moment someone reacts emotionally, argues repeatedly, or tries endlessly to explain themselves, the cycle continues. But when contact stops, the entire structure of that cycle is disrupted. Suddenly, the person who once held emotional influence no longer has access to the same reactions. Attention is no longer being supplied. For someone who depends on admiration, validation, or emotional responses, this absence can feel deeply unsettling. They may begin to question why the reaction they once received so easily is no longer available. Some may attempt to return through indirect communication, subtle reminders of their presence, or attempts to provoke a response. Yet the real power during this stage lies in restraint. The person who chooses silence is not simply avoiding conflict. They are reclaiming authority over their emotional energy. Instead of reacting to manipulation, they begin directing their focus toward growth, stability, and self-respect. This shift is profound because it changes the direction of influence. Instead of being controlled by someone else's behavior, a person begins controlling their own responses. And in life, the greatest power any individual can possess is mastery over their own reactions. During this same period, something remarkable begins happening internally. Emotional detox slowly begins. When a person has spent a long time in a relationship filled with manipulation, criticism, confusion, or emotional pressure, the mind becomes conditioned to operate in survival mode. The brain constantly tries to predict reactions, avoid conflict, or seek approval. But when silence enters the situation, the nervous system gradually begins to calm. The mind no longer has to analyze every message, every tone of voice, or every subtle change in behavior. Instead, it gains space to breathe. This is where healing quietly begins. Many people underestimate the impact of emotional environments on their mental clarity. When the pressure disappears, thoughts become clearer, decisions become more confident, and emotions become more balanced. The silence becomes like fresh air after being in a crowded room for too long. At first, it may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But over time, it becomes peaceful. In that peaceful space, people start recognizing how much of their energy was being drained. They begin rebuilding their inner stability and emotional independence. Perhaps the most surprising transformation is the restoration of identity. When someone spends a long time under the influence of manipulation or emotional control, they often begin questioning their own judgment. They may doubt their instincts, suppress their opinions, or adjust their behavior simply to avoid conflict. Over time, this can cause a person to lose touch with their authentic self. But distance changes that. When the constant influence disappears, the individual begins rediscovering their voice. They remember the goals they once had, the passions they set aside, and the values that truly matter to them. Silence becomes a place of rediscovery. It allows a person to rebuild confidence, not through someone else's approval, but through their own awareness and growth. They begin trusting their perception again. They begin setting boundaries that protect their peace. And perhaps most importantly, they start understanding that their worth was never dependent on someone else's validation. What once felt like abandonment gradually transforms into empowerment. The absence of contact becomes the very space where personal strength is rebuilt. And when someone fully reconnects with their identity, they no longer feel the need to return to environments that once diminished their sense of self. Silence, in that sense, does not represent loss. It represents the beginning of clarity, independence, and a stronger future. Something powerful begins to unfold the moment two people who were once constantly communicating suddenly fall into silence. When both you and a narcissistic individual stop contacting each other, the first thing that emerges is not peace, but revelation. Silence exposes what noise was hiding. For a long time, constant communication can keep people trapped in emotional confusion. Messages, arguments, apologies, and explanations create a cloud where truth becomes difficult to see. But once the contact stops, that cloud slowly begins to clear. The absence of conversation becomes a mirror that reflects reality. You begin to notice patterns you ignored before. You start remembering conversations that once seemed normal, but now reveal manipulation, control, or emotional imbalance. Distance does something powerful to the human mind. It allows the brain to process experiences without pressure. In that quiet space, your mind begins connecting the dots. You realize that many interactions were not about understanding, but about dominance. Silence becomes a classroom where you start learning lessons that were impossible to understand while you were emotionally involved. At the same time, something else begins to shift beneath the surface. When communication stops, the power dynamic changes. In many unhealthy relationships, one person subtly depends on the emotional reactions of the other. Attention becomes a form of fuel. Complaints, arguments, emotional responses, even attempts to explain yourself, all of these reactions provide energy to someone who thrives on control. When you remove that supply by refusing to engage, the entire structure begins to weaken. What once felt like a strong emotional grip suddenly loses its strength. The individual who once seemed powerful may begin to feel unsettled, because control cannot survive without participation. This is why silence often creates internal tension for someone who relied on influence. They may attempt to regain attention through unexpected messages, indirect contact, or situations designed to provoke a response. But the moment you understand that attention is the currency they once used to control the dynamic, you begin to realize something important. You are never as powerless as you believed. The simple decision to withdraw emotional engagement begins to restore balance. While that internal struggle may occur on their side, something far more valuable begins happening within you. Emotional detox starts quietly but profoundly. When people spend long periods inside confusing or manipulative dynamics, their thoughts often become tangled. They question their own perceptions. They replay conversations repeatedly in their minds. wondering whether they misunderstood something. This mental exhaustion slowly drains confidence and clarity, but silence interrupts that cycle. Without constant emotional stimulation, the mind gradually begins to reset. Your thoughts become calmer. The need to constantly analyze every interaction slowly fades. Instead of focusing on someone else's behavior, your attention returns to your own well-being. This is the moment when healing begins. Emotional detox is not dramatic, it is subtle. You start sleeping better. Your mind becomes quieter. You begin noticing parts of life that were overshadowed by stress and confusion. This process reminds you that peace is not something another person gives you. Peace is something that grows when chaos is removed. As the mind clears, another transformation begins to take place. Identity restoration. Many people do not realize how much of themselves they slowly lose while trying to maintain difficult relationships. They adjust their words to avoid conflict. They silence their opinions to keep the peace. They compromise their boundaries in hopes that things will improve. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate until a person barely recognizes their own voice. Silence, however, creates space for rediscovery. Without constant influence, you begin reconnecting with your original values. You remember the things that once made you confident and motivated. Your personal interests, goals, and dreams slowly return to the center of your attention. It becomes clear that your identity was never meant to revolve around managing someone else's behavior. Your identity is meant to grow through purpose, learning, and personal development. What once felt like loss gradually begins to look like liberation. And as this transformation unfolds, one final realization emerges. Distance creates clarity that closeness could never provide. When people are deeply involved in emotional situations, their perspective becomes narrow. Feelings overpower analysis, but separation widens your vision. You start evaluating the entire experience from a new level of understanding. You recognize warning signs you previously overlooked. You understand how certain patterns formed and why they continued for so long. Most importantly, you realize that the silence between you was not simply the end of communication, it was the beginning of wisdom. Every challenging relationship carries lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and emotional awareness. When those lessons are understood, the past loses its ability to control the future. Instead of wondering what the other person is doing, thinking, or planning, your attention turns towards something far more important, your growth. And once a person begins focusing on growth rather than reaction, their life begins moving in a completely new direction. When communication between you and a narcissistic individual suddenly stops, something unusual begins to unfold beneath the surface. At first, the silence may feel confusing. For many people, communication, whether healthy or toxic, creates a sense of emotional familiarity. When that constant interaction disappears, the mind initially experiences withdrawal. Questions begin to arise. Why did the contact stop? Will they reach out again? Did something change? However, as time passes, the silence slowly begins to reveal something far more important than answers about the other person. It begins to reveal the truth about the relationship itself. Without the constant cycle of arguments, explanations, and emotional pressure, your mind finally has the opportunity to step back and observe the situation objectively. Many people discover that what they once called love was actually a pattern of control, confusion, and emotional imbalance. Distance provides a perspective that closeness often hides. Another powerful shift that occurs during this silence is the change in emotional power. Narcissistic personalities often depend on attention, reactions, and emotional responses from others. These reactions act like fuel that keeps the dynamic alive. When contact stops from both sides, that fuel supply suddenly disappears. This can create a psychological disruption for the individual who relied on maintaining influence. Control thrives on interaction. When interaction disappears, control weakens. Meanwhile, the person who steps away from the cycle begins to experience something unexpected: mental space. This space allows thoughts to become clearer and decisions to become more rational rather than emotional. The absence of constant emotional tension allows the nervous system to calm down, and when the mind becomes calm, it becomes capable of analyzing situations with greater wisdom. During this period, many individuals begin to go through what can be described as emotional detox. Just as the body requires time to remove harmful substances, the mind also requires time to release the effects of manipulation, criticism, and psychological pressure. For a long time, a person may have been adjusting their behavior in order to avoid conflict or maintain peace. They may have constantly questioned their own judgment because they were repeatedly told that their feelings were incorrect or exaggerated. When silence enters the picture, the mind slowly begins to reset. Thoughts that once felt confusing begin to organize themselves. Memories that once seemed normal begin to reveal patterns that were previously overlooked. This detox process is not always comfortable because it requires confronting truths that were once ignored. Yet it is an essential stage of healing. As the emotional fog clears, another transformation begins to take place, the restoration of personal identity. In difficult relational dynamics, people often lose connection with their own values, preferences, and priorities. They become so focused on maintaining stability in the relationship that they stop asking themselves what truly matters to them. Silence creates an opportunity to rediscover these answers. Individuals begin to reconnect with interests they had neglected, goals they had postponed, and qualities within themselves that had been overshadowed. This rediscovery process is powerful because it shifts attention away from the behavior of the other person and redirects it toward personal development. Instead of analyzing someone else's motives, energy begins to flow toward understanding one's own purpose. Interestingly, while one person may be rebuilding their inner stability, the narcissistic individual may be experiencing a very different internal process. The loss of attention often creates frustration because the usual methods of influence are no longer effective. Without reactions to feed on, the individual may attempt to regain control through indirect means such as sudden messages, emotional appeals, or attempts to provoke curiosity. However, these attempts only succeed if the cycle of reaction begins again. When a person maintains their silence and continues focusing on their own growth, the old patterns gradually lose their strength. This demonstrates an important psychological principle. Unhealthy dynamics cannot survive without participation from both sides. Eventually, something remarkable begins to happen. The person who once felt emotionally overwhelmed begins to develop clarity, confidence, and emotional independence. They begin to recognize that the silence was not simply an absence of communication. It was an opportunity for education. Through distance, they learned the importance of boundaries, the value of self-respect, and the necessity of emotional responsibility in relationships. The experience becomes a lesson in discernment. Discernment allows individuals to recognize the difference between attention and genuine care, between manipulation and authentic support. Instead of repeating the same patterns in future relationships, they move forward with a deeper understanding of what healthy connection truly requires. In this way, the silence that once seemed shocking ultimately becomes the beginning of personal transformation. When silence finally enters a relationship that was once filled with tension, confusion, and emotional push and pull, something unusual begins to unfold. At first, the quiet feels uncomfortable. Human beings are naturally wired for communication, so when contact suddenly stops, the mind begins asking questions. What are they thinking? Why haven't they reached out? Will they come back? But beneath those questions lies something deeper, an opportunity for emotional detox. Distance from constant manipulation allows the mind to settle. When a person is no longer exposed to criticism, guilt-tripping, or emotional games, the nervous system slowly relaxes. Thoughts become clearer, and feelings begin to organize themselves. In many cases, people only realize how drained they were after the silence begins. The absence of chaos becomes evidence that the relationship was heavier than they understood. Silence, therefore, becomes the first step toward recovery. At the same time, another transformation begins inside the individual who chose to stop engaging. Without the constant influence of someone who tried to shape their emotions and decisions, identity slowly starts to return. During manipulative relationships, many people unknowingly lose their sense of self. They adjust their behavior to avoid conflict, hide their opinions to prevent criticism, and question their instincts because they were repeatedly told they were wrong. But once communication ends, the pressure to perform disappears. A person begins asking simple but powerful questions. What do I actually believe? What do I want for my life? What kind of relationships do I truly deserve? This rediscovery process is not instant, but it is deeply educational. Silence gives individuals the mental space required to rebuild confidence and reconnect with their values. Meanwhile, the other side of the dynamic often experiences a different internal reaction. Individuals who depend heavily on attention and admiration frequently struggle when those emotional supplies disappear. When someone who once responded to every message, argument, or demand suddenly becomes unavailable, the loss of control can create frustration. For some, it triggers curiosity. For others, it triggers attempts to re-establish contact in subtle or indirect ways. They may appear again with friendly messages, dramatic apologies, or unexpected gestures. The goal in many cases is not necessarily genuine reconciliation, but rather the restoration of influence. When attention returns, control returns. This is why silence often becomes a powerful shift in the balance of emotional power. Yet the most significant change is not happening in the other person's behavior. It is happening in the growth of the individual who is learning from the experience. Distance provides clarity. Situations that once felt confusing begin to make sense when viewed from a calmer perspective. Patterns that were previously invisible suddenly become obvious. A person may recognize how arguments followed predictable cycles, how praise was often followed by criticism, or how emotional reactions were repeatedly provoked. This awareness becomes a form of education. It teaches emotional intelligence and strengthens discernment. Once someone sees these patterns clearly, it becomes much harder to ignore them in the future. As this awareness deepens, personal responsibility also increases. Instead of focusing entirely on the other person's behavior, individuals begin examining their own choices. They ask themselves why they tolerated certain treatment, why they ignored early warning signs, or why they tried so hard to fix someone who did not want to change. These reflections are not meant to create guilt, but to develop wisdom. Every challenging relationship can become a powerful lesson in boundaries. Learning when to step back, when to speak up, and when to walk away is an essential skill for emotional health. Eventually, a remarkable shift begins to occur. The silence that once felt painful starts to feel peaceful. Instead of waiting for a message or worrying about someone's reaction, people begin investing their energy into their own development. They focus on their goals, their work, their friendships, and their personal growth. The emotional space that was once occupied by conflict becomes available for creativity, learning, and self-improvement. In this stage, the past loses much of its power. What once felt like a personal rejection begins to look more like a necessary separation that created room for transformation. The truth is that many individuals expect closure to come through one final conversation, one last explanation, or one dramatic resolution. But life often teaches closure through distance rather than dialogue. When two people stop contacting each other, time reveals what words could not. It exposes intentions, clarifies patterns, and forces each person to confront their own character. Some people grow from the experience and build healthier relationships in the future. Others repeat the same cycles with new partners because they never examined themselves. For those who choose growth, silence becomes more than the end of communication. It becomes the beginning of wisdom. Instead of defining themselves by what happened, they define themselves by what they learned. And once that lesson is understood, the experience no longer feels like a loss. It becomes a turning point that prepared them for stronger relationships, clearer boundaries, and a more purposeful life. When communication suddenly stops between you and a narcissistic person, the silence becomes more than just the absence of words. It becomes a mirror that reveals truths that were once hidden beneath emotional noise. In many toxic relationships, constant conversation, arguments, apologies, and explanations create confusion. Words are used not to build understanding, but to maintain influence. When that stream of interaction finally stops, the emotional fog begins to clear. In that quiet space, people often start seeing patterns they previously ignored. They realize that many conflicts were not misunderstandings but strategies. The silence exposes character, motives, and emotional maturity. It becomes clear who was seeking connection and who was seeking control. This realization can be uncomfortable at first, but it is also the beginning of emotional awareness and personal freedom. As the silence continues, the balance of power slowly begins to shift. Narcissistic personalities often rely on attention, reactions, and emotional responses from others to maintain a sense of importance. When contact ends, that source of validation disappears. Without the ability to provoke reactions, manipulate emotions, or create drama, the control they once exercised weakens. At the same time, the person who chose distance begins to reclaim emotional authority. Instead of reacting impulsively to messages, accusations, or guilt-driven conversations, they regain the ability to pause, think, and choose their responses carefully. This shift in power is not about revenge or winning a psychological battle. It is about regaining ownership of one's peace, energy, and attention. Another powerful transformation that occurs during this silence is emotional detoxification. Relationships involving manipulation often create a cycle of stress, confusion, and self-doubt. People may constantly question their decisions, their worth, or their perception of events. But when communication stops, the mind finally receives the rest it has been denied. Emotional detox begins slowly. The mind starts to process experiences with greater clarity. Feelings that were suppressed during constant conflict begin to surface and heal. Like a person stepping away from polluted air to breathe fresh oxygen, the emotional system begins to recover from psychological pressure. This process can be challenging, but it is also necessary for mental and emotional restoration. With time and distance, something even more powerful begins to happen: the restoration of identity. Many people who spend time in manipulative relationships gradually lose touch with their authentic voice. Their opinions become shaped by someone else's approval or criticism. Their choices become influenced by fear of conflict or rejection. When contact ends, however, the mind slowly reconnects with its original values. Individuals begin remembering what they enjoy, what they believe, and what truly matters to them. They rediscover personal boundaries that were once ignored. This stage of rediscovery can feel like meeting oneself again after a long period of emotional exile. While one person experiences growth, the narcissistic individual may experience something very different: internal conflict. Without attention, admiration, or emotional reactions to feed their sense of control, they may feel a loss of influence. This can lead to frustration, attempts to re-establish communication, or subtle strategies designed to regain attention. Some may attempt to provoke curiosity, guilt, or nostalgia in order to reopen the connection. However, this reaction reveals an important lesson. It shows that the relationship was not sustained by genuine emotional investment, but by the continuous supply of attention and validation. During this period of distance, clarity also begins to develop. Situations that once seemed confusing start to make sense. Conversations that once left emotional scars can now be analyzed objectively. The mind recognizes behavioral patterns that were difficult to identify while emotionally involved. This clarity acts like a form of education. It teaches individuals how manipulation operates, how emotional control is exercised, and how healthy relationships differ from unhealthy ones. Knowledge gained through experience often becomes one of life's most powerful teachers. As understanding grows, the silence begins transforming from a painful separation into an opportunity for personal development. Instead of focusing on what the other person is doing or thinking, attention shifts towards self-improvement. People begin investing energy into learning, healing, and building stronger emotional boundaries. They strengthen their self-respect and become more aware of the kind of relationships they want in the future. This growth does not occur overnight, but every moment of reflection contributes to emotional maturity. Eventually, the silence leads to one final realization. The future belongs to the person who accepts responsibility for their own direction. Instead of waiting for closure, explanations, or apologies, individuals begin creating their own sense of resolution. They stop measuring their value through someone else's approval. They understand that freedom is not simply the absence of a toxic relationship, but the presence of purpose, self-awareness, and emotional strength. When someone reaches this point, the silence that once felt shocking becomes something entirely different. It becomes the moment where life quietly shifted from confusion to clarity, from dependency to independence, and from emotional survival to genuine personal growth. And the same principle applies to you. Your future will never be determined by the people who misunderstood you. Your future will be determined by how you use your moments of separation. So instead of fearing the silence, study it. Instead of chasing explanations, build your purpose. Because when you stop feeding dysfunction and start feeding growth, something remarkable happens. You stop reacting to the past and you start creating the future. And that is the moment when your life truly changes. Thank you.